what are the impacts of sanctions on a country's economy, considering the recent sanctions imposed on Russia? What are those impacts on the European Union and Germany? You may talk about Cuba and other countries that have been sanctioned for many years, for decades.
There is a considerably large experience of sanctions over the last 50 years. They have been levied by different countries on other countries. We have much research about that. There is no simple or single answer. Sanctions don't always do the same thing. They often have consequences different from the intentions of whoever is imposing the sanctions. So there is no simple answer. In modern times, there have been sanctions imposed for over half a century by the United States, for example, on Cuba, that continue to this day. Then there have been sanctions, particularly by the United States, on many other countries. North Korea, Vietnam at various times in various ways, Iran for sure. And now in modern times, the one that everybody is talking about now is the mother of all sanctions, as it has been called, because it is so large and so many countries are involved. The United States currently, for example, is not only sanctioning Russia, which it is, and sanctioning China, which it is, but it is mobilized many of the other countries that are allies of the United States, particularly the G7, that's the United States, Britain, France, Germany, Italy, Japan, and Canada, to join in the sanctions against Russia. Then there are sanctions that are not called sanctions, but they are, namely what President Trump and Biden have done to China, imposing unilateral tariffs, imposing unilateral trade restrictions, imposing them, by the way, not only on China or Russia as a whole, but often on particular companies. For example, there are US sanctions against companies that do business with certain countries. In other words, there's an attempt to punish or to prevent that. By far, the most common sanction comes from the United States, which is, of course, the country that for most of the last 75 years, since the end of Second World War, has been globally dominant. And you can measure the threats to that dominance, and you can measure the decline of that dominance by the number and size and duration of the sanctions levied by the United States. It is not the only country that has done that, but it is by far the major user. Just like the United States has more military bases around the world than all other countries combined. Just like the United States spends more on military activity than the next 9 countries combined do. And those 9 countries include Russia and China. Okay, here's the problem with sanctions. They are very hard to monitor, they are very hard to enforce, and they are not difficult to evade. So what happens is countries and companies find ways to evade sanctions, and the country imposing the sanctions have all kinds of difficulty making them work because it is easy to evade them. Other than that, I don't know what to tell you. In the case of the sanctions against Russia, the point is made there that they have been massively evaded by Russia, and they have been, unfortunately, producing side effects, often unintended side effects, although there is debate about whether that was unintended or not. Depends on your point of view. Let me give you a few examples. The major sanctions against Russia were designed to damage the Russian economy by closing off export markets, particularly in Europe, and particularly for Russian oil and gas. Like many countries, Russia's economy depends heavily on the export of oil and gas. Other countries include Saudi Arabia, Iran, Nigeria, Venezuela, and many others. You can see most of them gathered in the organization known as OPEC. Here's the problem. A ship full of Russian oil leaves Russia and goes, I'm going to pick, well, it doesn't matter, goes to a country in Africa. Okay? It comes into the port in the African country, and it loads off the oil from the ship onto a tank in the harbor. Okay. 2 days later, another ship comes in. Let's say a ship from, doesn't matter, India. And the oil is put onto the ship from India. And then that ship goes to a European country. On the invoice, it says oil into, let's say, the Netherlands from India. Who knows? Oil is oil. Very hard to understand, very hard to follow, easy to get around. Now, there will be costs, extra cost to ship the oil here. As American monitoring gets better, you may have to go further to hide it, but it is done all the time. Gas can be converted from gas form to liquid. That's called a liquefied natural gas. That also, you cannot tell where the gas came from, and the oil can be shipped anywhere. Then there's the following. If you are successful with your sanctions, let's assume 2/3 of the oil that Russia used to ship to Western Europe is blocked by the sanctions. The other third goes, as I just told you, is evaded. Well, now a cut, even if it's a cut of only 2/3 what was set out, if the sanctions were very heavy, and they were on Russian oil, and there weren't too many exceptions, I should note for you that there always were and are exceptions, official exceptions requested and given. But let's assume that nonetheless there was some success in reducing the flow of oil and gas to Europe. Well, that meant that the oil and gas companies that used to bring the oil in would be in a position to do one of two things: either find oil someplace else and probably have to pay more for it because they went to Russian oil because it was the cheapest. So if they can't get Russian oil, they have to go somewhere else. And then they raise the price because they pay more for the oil that comes from outside of Russia. But these oil and gas companies rarely miss an opportunity to raise prices. And now they have a wonderful excuse. They can raise the price of energy in Germany, in Switzerland, in France, Italy, Britain, and so on. And they can blame Putin. They can blame the Ukraine war. They can blame anybody but their own profiteering. All capitalist corporations are constantly looking at prices to see if they can raise them without damaging their profits. If raising the price doesn't lose too much of your sales, you do it. And in the environment of the Ukraine war, which was the environment of these sanctions, the oil companies, the gas companies were ripping off the populations of Western Europe spectacularly. And there was nothing anybody could do really about it. The Russians weren't going to help. They couldn't have anyway. China and India solved the problem for Russia by buying the oil and gas from Russia that it couldn't sell. So the goal of the sanctions, which was to cripple the Russian economy, clearly failed. And it had the side effect, and you can argue whether it was intended or unintended, it had the side effect of severely damaging the European economy, because the cost of energy, the oil and gas that fueled the entire industrial base of Europe, made European products uncompetitive. Because the European, for example, European car manufacturer has to pay much more for oil and gas to fuel the car company. And you can't compete because China is getting cheap oil and gas from Russia, and the Europeans are not. The United States produces its own energy and therefore doesn't care. Indeed, a good portion of the gas coming from Russia into Western Europe was replaced by liquefied natural gas from the United States, but at a much higher price than the Europeans had been paying for Russian gas. Long story short, this program of sanctions, led by the United States, joined by the Europeans, has been very costly, above all to the Western Europeans. They have had to pay very high prices for energy, and it has hurt their industry. To give you one example, up until 2-3 years ago, the leading industrial export economy of all of Europe was Germany. Today, Germany is one of the poorest performing countries in Europe. It has been a very bad time. But there's nothing the industry could do because everything was captured by the idea of the fight for Ukraine against Russia, and nobody could stop them. But I can assure you, and the audience that is watching this, that in every European country, Britain, France, Germany, Italy, Netherlands, or any other, there is enormous political turmoil because many, many industries, corporations, wealthy, powerful businesses are being badly hurt and want the war to stop so they can go back and buy cheap Russian oil and gas. It's a very, very politically volatile situation because of all of this. Meanwhile, the Russian economy is actually in quite good shape. Producing for the war in Ukraine has given them a fiscal stimulus. The government has borrowed and pumped money in to build up its military. Its alliances, particularly with China, but also with the BRICS, both the BRICS before and after the expansion of the BRICS with the addition of 6 new countries to the 5 original countries, mean that Russia has more and richer allies than it had before. The sanctions have worked to strengthen, enlarge, and solidify a new international force in the world economy that was developing already, but has gotten an enormous stimulus, has gone faster, further than anyone foresaw because of the war. The irony is that this war is straining the alliance of the G7, and it is boosting and strengthening the BRICS. And since the BRICS already, as a group, produce a larger GDP, taking them all together, than the G7, it means that the new world economy is an emerging, dominating BRICS and a declining dominance of the G7. And the sanctions have not and do not look like they are going to be able to stop it. And the irony is they probably speeded that process up.
We know that these sanctions were imposed by Germany, by the West on Russia. These sanctions are firing back at Germany, at the European Union, at the United States. Now, when you think about Cuba, Iran, that have been under sanctions for years, for decades, in each and every sector. Now it is just an energy sector for Europe. When you impose sanctions on each and every part of their economy, it suffocates their economy. It's worse than war.
Yeah, well, the answer is there's another name for sanctions that is as old as the human race. It's called the siege. The siege has been used, in ancient times, in the times of the Greek and Roman Empire, Persian Empire, all of them. Instead of fighting a war, you surround a city and you don't let food in and you don't let water in and you starve the people. You destroy their ability to function. So siege is the English word for this. And it's a kind of a forerunner to sanction, or a form of sanctioning the flow of goods and services. All I can tell you is that it can slow a society, it can hurt a society, but I think both Cuba and Iran show you do not win that war. The Cubans have 90 miles from the United States, a small country, population from the beginning around 8 million to 11 million now. They have resisted the most powerful country in the world, for over half a century, 90 miles away, a poor country whose major product, sugar, has been blocked from the United States. It's amazing that they survived. It's really more impressive that the sanctions didn't work. They were designed to overthrow the regime of Fidel Castro. They didn't. They couldn't do it. Tried it for 50 years. They failed for 50 years. And the politics of Iran, they didn't sanction the Shah, and he was overthrown. They have sanctioned the mullahs, the ayatollahs, and it hasn't worked. It hasn't overthrown that regime at all. And the troubles, if you like, the political upheaval in Iran now, led, if I understand correctly, by Iranian women, is around a whole nother set of issues that are not going to be all that affected by this sanctions program. The Nobel Peace Prize was just awarded to one of those women, and the consequences of that will play themselves out. There is a theory about sanctions that I should mention to you, which is that we should not discuss them in terms of how effective they are, how easily evaded they are, because that takes them seriously as if their purpose was to change the behavior of the target of the sanctions. So in this case, Russia, or in these earlier examples, Cuba or Iran or others. The theory goes that these are domestic policies. These are behaviors, policies that are designed to show to the American people that the government is doing something about whoever the bad person is or the bad country is. It's for domestic consumption. It is a theater of activity. It is not a policy really designed to get a particular outcome. And there are significantly groups of people around the world, including here in the United States, who believe that and who write books and articles making very powerful arguments about that. And that the sanctions are an internal political theater designed to get popular support, designed to win elections at home, and for that purpose, so they look like they're terrible and powerful and but they're not. And they are usually much cheaper than actually fighting a war, and they don't kill at least your own people the way a war would. So they are seen as a substitute, if you like, for war. And I think there is a lot of merit, and that you have to look at each particular example of sanctions to see what proportion of it is really about the other country and what proportion of a sanctions program is really a kind of internal politics going on.
We know that beside these sanctions on Russia, we have a trade war between the United States and China. It has a very powerful impact on the global economy. How do you see this? Is it going to get worse? Is it going to get better?
Okay, yes. Again, sanctions is a general term. Some people would not be happy to put trade war or tariff war under the label sanctions. Other people would. I'm happy to see them all for what they are. They are efforts in this case, by the United States to do something which I don't think will work, which I don't think has worked, but which has certainly had effects on the global economy. So let me give you the example. The basic problem in the United States relationship with China is that these are now the two dominant, powerful economies in the world, the United States and China. No one else comes close to them. And a simple way to understand that is just to look at the GDP, the gross domestic product of the United States. And remember, GDP is simply a measure of the total output of goods and services in one calendar year, one period of 12 months. So the most recent GDP of the United States is in the neighborhood of $22-23 trillion. The most recent GDP of the People's Republic of China in the neighborhood of $17-18 trillion. And there's disagreement about these numbers, but that's the order of magnitude. And nobody else is close. You know, Britain's is maybe 5 or 6 trillion. Germany's in the same area. Nowhere close. Nowhere close. Okay, so the United States finds this very frightening and troubling. They had no competitor for the last century. The United States came out of World War II, remember, the top dog, the top economic power. All the others that might have been competitors or challengers of the United States were destroyed in that war. Japan and Germany, the enemies, but also Russia, Britain, France, the allies. So when that war was over, having been fought on the territory of all of those countries, was not fought on the United States, with the exception of Pearl Harbor at the very beginning of the war, and then never again. And the United States lost a smaller portion of its population. Really, what the war did was put the American unemployed out of the Great Depression back to work. So it was an enormous boost to the American economy and a tremendous depression of the rest of the world. It's a little bit like what's happening in this war between Russia and Ukraine. Ukraine is destroyed. Russia is getting bigger and richer because of this war. Well, we had something like that, the United States emerging in 1945 as the dominant world power. The British Empire was finished. It had already been declining for half a century, but World Wars I and II finished the British Empire. The United States went in and replaced the British Empire. It became the dominant empire, stronger, more global than the British had ever been. What is happening now, and it's a historical moment that we are all living through, and we should be conscious of it, is that the Chinese are challenging the Americans. And they've been doing that for 20 years, maybe 30, maybe even 35. During most of that time, say the 30 years before 2015, in those 30 years, the United States and China did more and more trade with one another. It was a period of profitability in both the United States and China. It was prosperous for both countries, but there was a difference. The Chinese economy grew much faster than the US economy grew. Now, it wasn't noticed because the US economy was much richer than the Chinese. Remember, you may be producing this amount, but you only have to distribute it among 300 million Americans. The Chinese have to distribute a smaller output among 1.4 billion Chinese citizens. So you didn't notice it unless you were a China expert watching it. And people like me, I was, and people like me had to worry, are the statistics coming from China reliable? Are they accurate? All of that. So for the 30 years that US and China worked together, traded together, invested in each other's countries, I assume you know the history. After the Chinese Revolution in 1949, the United States would not recognize China. It was only in the beginning of the 1970s that the then President Nixon went to China to open up relations. So for the last 30, 40 years, China and the United States have been partners, peaceful, prosperous. And then around 2015, it began to be clear to more and more Americans that unlike any other country in the global South, the People's Republic of China, which had never been a colony of anybody, was able to develop economically faster than anyone had ever seen before. You really cannot criticize the Americans. They didn't expect a level of speed in economic development that the Chinese were able to achieve. So by 2015, the United States has a competitor, and a competitor everywhere, not just in producing clothing and appliances, but in capital goods, in machinery, in the highest technology. You know, the Chinese equivalent of Google or Apple or Intel or Cisco Systems or any of the high-tech industries of the United States, the Chinese can do as well or better. That's why you see the attack on the Chinese company Huawei. It's just a history of that kind of behavior. So the United States, in fear, in surprise, has been reacting to the challenge of China since about 2015, when Mr. Trump went to war, tariff war, trade war against China. The government here and much of the American capitalist employer class was hopeful that these policies would make China's development slow down, would make perhaps China realize that to continue to grow, they had to become more like the United States, less socialist, more capitalist, or make some other accommodations. None of that happened. The pressure from the United States was not sufficient, not to change the government, not to change the economic system. In fact, it didn't accomplish what it set out to do. And the United States really doesn't know what to do. That's why, even though the new administration of Biden replaced Trump, he has basically kept the same tariffs and the same trade war provisions that he inherited from Mr. Trump. And it isn't working now either. For most of the last 30 years, and for right now, Chinese GDP is growing 2 to 3 times faster than that of the United States. And this has been going on for 30 years. And there is no end in sight. When you add to that the fact that the Chinese have been able to develop the BRICS alliance and now the expanded BRICS alliance, which has a dozen more countries applying to join than the 11 that are already in there, whereas the United States is in no comparable expansion with the G7, you can begin to see that what we have here is the attempt to stop or reverse history. And the record in human history of the ability to do that is not favorable to the United States. Every other empire arose, developed over time, and then was replaced by another one. The United States empire developed early in the 20th century. It developed and evolved across the 20th into the 21st century, but now it is passing. And so are its allies, chiefly the G7, and chiefly among them, Germany, Japan, and so on. And they are all having huge economic problems that are compromising their economic growth. Therefore, what you're seeing is less a program that will really achieve the goal of removing the Chinese competitor, but it looks more and more like a kind of domestic theater. The president has to look like he's doing something because we have this new reality. It's a little bit like what the British Empire had to do when it was challenged by the colony in North America. There was a war, 1776, a revolutionary war in which the North American colony broke away from the British Empire through a violent war, which the British Empire assumed it could win, but it didn't. It lost. In 1812, it tried again in another war, and it lost that one too. And after that, it didn't try militarily anymore. And what the British did in the last 3/4 of the 19th century was come to terms with the United States, work out a coexistence. They played with the idea of allying with the South in the American Civil War in the 1860s, but they thought better of it, and they stayed with the North, the winner. But no more war against the United States, because they understood, even though they didn't want to, that their history as a global empire was over. Just like they understand it now, even better. The Americans are early into the decline of their empire. So they are still shaking their sabers, rattling their nuclear weapons, but they understand, I hope, that China has nuclear weapons too, and going to war makes no sense at all. And if they remember the American history, it was a waste back then for the British to try. Their empire was over. And the Chinese, still early in their ascendancy, may in fact give the world something new, namely, not replace an old empire of one country with a new empire of another country, but they might make it a multinational effort. And if you watch what's going on inside the BRICS, you have these different tendencies. Some people want the Chinese yuan to replace the dollar, which replaced the British pound, and so on. Whereas others say, no, we don't want the yuan. We want a collective currency, either that we all use or that is the reserve for all of us. And then that would be a very different way of organizing the world economy. But you have the exploratory, interesting, new ideas on one side of this story, and an ever more desperate desire to hold on the side of those that are in the declining phase of their role. And it's very hard here in the United States, where I live and work, very hard to explain this to people because they kind of half know it and they don't want it. And that's a very difficult moment. And it's partly why our politics are so bizarre. The divisions in our society, so hostile, so extreme. so desperate. And the effort of those at the top, the wealthy, the powerful, to hold on to their wealth and power and make the decline of the American empire hurt those at the bottom most. And of course, those at the bottom feel it, see it, and are enraged, but they don't know where to focus their upset. Some of them will focus it on China. Some of them will focus it on the capitalist ruling class in this country. And many of them will focus it on each other, white against black, Christian against non-Christian, and all of that is being provoked by this large historical process, and at this point is frightening in the ways that it is evolving. We face in the United States a resurgence of interest in socialism, but also a resurgence of interest in fascism. And those are the two growing tendencies as the middle disappears.
The Europeans, are they gonna be able to go along with the US foreign policy on China, or they gonna choose a different path to work with China? They're totally in line with the US on Russia, but how does it work considering China?
Well, I think the Europeans are in perhaps the worst position in the world economy. They are caught between the United States on the one hand and China on the other. And they are not powerful enough to dictate to either one. So they are caught in a dilemma. Now, the dilemma is in good part of their own making. They really can't blame anyone but themselves, even though I'm sure they will try. First of all, Europe has always, at least for 100 years, probably for 200 or 300, worried as it saw the rise of the United States to the West and the rise and consolidation of a single powerful government in Russia to the East, that they were in the middle, that they were in danger of being the war zone between these two, that they would be forced to choose, that they would be discriminated against, etc. That's why they have made one alliance after another. That's why they haven't trusted the United States all that much. They didn't trust Russia all that much. But now they're in a situation where they could have been, particularly after World War II, they could have understood this situation to require them to unify and become a solid, rich bloc of people. Population, they are bigger than the United States or Russia if they held together. But they would have to overcome the legacy of slavery and feudalism that created all these little countries, Belgium, Poland, Portugal. It's ridiculous. And each of them with their own government, many of them with their own languages, etc., etc. This was an inheritance that they had to face and deal with. And there were always voices in Europe that understood that and that pushed for that, but they weren't strong enough. They couldn't overcome the narrow interests of capitalists trying to make a profit and not seeing beyond that, wanting the local politicians to help them, not having a broader ability to see the situation. So what happened was the Europeans have now found themselves in their own worst nightmare. The United States needs them less and less. The Russians would have gone with them if they made an overture to the Russians to work something out, but they didn't. They made the decision without courage to become the assistant of the United States. That put Russia in an impossible situation. And the Russians have now done what they were moving toward for decades, which is seeing their safety and their future in Asia. Since half of Russia is in Asia geographically, this was not surprising. Russia has always straddled Europe in one way, Asia in another, the way countries in the Middle East have always done too, Iran, Turkey, etc. And the Russians have now made their decision, partly forced by the United States, but partly forced by Europe's inability, unwillingness to create a European economic powerhouse that would negotiate as an independent unity with the United States on one hand and now Russia, China on the other. They didn't do that, but they could have. Now it may well be too late. The Russians have made their move. They've allied with the Chinese. Europe is led by people who do what the United States wants. As I said to you before, I think you're going to see in Europe pretty soon a political explosion as these societies fight within themselves between those who are the conservatives, the ones now in charge, who want to do and go with the United States, and those who do not. If Germany wants to remain as the industrial powerhouse, they actually have more to gain by exporting machinery to China and India than they have with the United States. And many German capitalists know it, understand it, and are trying to figure out how to get this done. And if they come up with something, you're going to see the current crop of political leaders in Germany disappear. You know, there's a famous philosopher who said, you know, beware if you live in interesting times. These are times that are very interesting, but they are also full of enormous dangers and conflicts and opportunities. Whether the people of this time will understand and seize the opportunities, or whether they will turn inward and fearfully try to hold back history, we will see. But whatever they do, I do not think the history will be held back now any more than it was held back before. The British Empire was over even in the moment that they defeated Napoleon. They didn't understand it. They should have. There were people who came shortly afterwards who understood it, who even tried to bring it together. Think about Bismarck in Germany or Garibaldi in Italy. You know, they understood what needed to be done. Even modern day politicians, when the wall fell down in Eastern Europe and you had a unification of East and Western Europe, you could then have created that European unity. But you would have had to be critical of the United States. You would have had to go your own way. And that would have been difficult, especially because of what happened in World War II. But if you didn't do it, you would put yourself in the position that Europe now finds itself in. And therefore, you have to, in honesty, think back then that there were very, very bad mistakes. Mistakes of judgment, mistakes of analysis, and mistakes of political courage in the face of that. By comparison, the risks taken by Mao Zedong are enormous. Look at what he accomplished. It's the fastest economic growth the world has ever seen. From the largest country that was also arguably the poorest country in the world, it has in 30 years, one generation, become the challenger to the ruling global empire. I mean, you can pretend any which way you want. That is a world historical reality. And the countries or the mentalities that refuse to see that, those are not the people we should be listening to, because they're like the people who see an enormous wave coming into shore from the ocean and are so frightened by what it might mean that they turn around and look into the land. And of course, the wave is not going to stop because they're not looking at it. It's going to come and be more devastating because they were looking in the wrong direction.